isquis pilasis in Synackstx ut in tum isquis lore Wiley ut in mistum Chris Parkin. My name is Danica Parkin, or Pilasis. I'm Synackstx, and my parents are Lore Wiley and Chris Parkin, and who are some of the founders of the Salish School of Spokane. And I'd like to open with just a short prayer. Lim lamquil chuten, lim temenwi salhalt, lim temenwi seithen, lim temenwi tampulau, lim temenwi temyo. Creator, thank you for this day. Thank you for the food that nourishes our bodies. Thank you for this land, and thank you for the animals. So that's just our brief prayer to get us started. I'm going to work on sharing my screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey as a family nurse practitioner and how I got to this place, and kind of what it took, why I made the choices I did, and then my current work in pediatrics, supporting families, but also supporting Native families in my community in the Spokane area through my work in my practice, but also through my work with Salish School of Spokane. So here's a little bit about my background, all the professional stats. I am a family nurse practitioner, and I'm certified by the American Academy of Nurse Practitioners as a family nurse practitioner. I'm licensed as a ARNP, or nurse practitioner, in Washington State. I have 2 bachelor's degrees, one from the Evergreen State College, and one from Washington State University in nursing, and then a master's degree in that family nurse practitioner program, and that's a master's of science in nursing. So I took a long path to get where I am because I did 7 years of undergraduate studies straight. So, my brother bought me a magnet that said, college, the best 7 years of my life. And he says, get it? It's supposed to be a joke, but then you did that. So it was long. And then I went straight into the master's of nursing science right after those 7 years. So it was a long journey. But I'm glad that I made my way, and I'm actually very glad I made the decisions that I made. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal life really quick, and just who I am personally. Now I talked about who I am professionally. So I'm Synackstx. I'm an Arrow Lakes band descendant. My mom's a Colville tribal member. Arrow Lakes is one of the bands of the Colville Confederated Tribes. A little bit on that's interesting is that we're the only band in the Colville tribe that does not have any of our traditional lands included in the reservation. Our traditional lands were from Kettle Falls, Washington, up to Revelstoke, BC, at the top of the Arrow Lakes. The tribe owns an acre of land that isn't even considered part of the reservation. That's a Catholic mission by Kettle Falls. And so I think it's important to think about that. It's meant a lot for me and my family about maybe why we've had disconnection in our past and have had to work hard to regain our connection and knowledge about things. If you are interested in learning more about that, Rick Disotell recently had his case heard in the in the Canadian Supreme Court. And that case is Disotell versus the Crown. And that's about us and the Synackstx and whether or not we have rights in Canada. So specifically, his case focuses on hunting. But if you're interested, follow that. We have to wait almost a year to hear the results after having our trial this fall. I am a mother of 3 children. They are ages 13, 7, and 2.5. So we jokingly say that they are 3 only children, because we got 3 separate stages of development going on in one house. and it's fun and it's a wild ride. I live in Spokane, Washington, and I grew up in Chewelah, Washington, which is about an hour north of Spokane. So that's not, I grew up off res, but near part of the Colville Reservation. I am deeply connected to the urban Indigenous community here in Spokane, and a lot of that is through the work at Salish School of Spokane, which I'm going to talk about at the end of my presentation. So this is a picture of me and my family, and then also of some medicine, of some rose medicine from that land up in Kettle Falls that my family likes to go to. So my long and winding road to becoming a nurse practitioner. It really started when I was a student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia. And I was, a full-time student during the day, but I ended up signing up for this just little 2-credit class that was in the evenings. And it was a health lecture series. And there are different professionals coming in, different health topics. So like a naturopath, a physician, nurses, and then midwives. And a midwife came into this class that I was in and talked about her work. And I was very interested in it. And I had somebody that I was friends with sitting next to me. And she was like, wow, you're really into this. I'm really into this too. I've wanted to be a midwife and I'm starting to try to go down that path. I have books you can borrow. And so she gave me things to read and I was really interested. Part of the spark for me was that my brother and I had both been born in a freestanding birth center in Spokane with nurse midwives. And my mom was the first person in her family for a couple of generations to give birth outside of the hospital. And that was just something that she decided on her own, which I still feel so much gratitude for. But it felt right for her. And so there was a spark in me knowing like, okay, there was a midwife when I was born, and I just had a lot of interest in that. So I started reading books. I had been studying environmental science before I took this health class. So like environmental economics and biology and other kind of life sciences. Excuse me. And I had worked for Washington State Parks at different times as a park aide, and my aunt was a park ranger. And so that was some of my experience. But this health class really kind of switched me from looking at environmental health to human health, and knowing that those are interrelated, but having some interest in that. So I really was interested in this midwifery piece, and I ended up writing my own program in college so that I could become a doula, because I was really drawn after reading birth stories and reading some books about midwifery. And so I constructed my own class, which students are able to do at the Evergreen State College. And I was able to write my own course for credit. And so I took the labor doula course at Seattle Midwifery School, which is now Bastyr, I believe. And so I spent a lot of time reading about pregnancy, writing papers, and I was thinking about being a midwife. I was most interested in home birth and was really thinking about that route. The college also offered a program to become a medical assistant. And I was working on kind of some prerequisites for health sciences. And I thought, well, I'll do that. That'll like give me an idea of whether or not I have some interest in this. So I started that program at the clinic campus, and that allowed me to go from no knowledge, no training, to being like licensed with the state as a medical assistant in 1 year, and then also work at the clinic in the medical assisting role. So I spent some time in that program, and about the time that I started that program, I also found out that I was pregnant. And I was pregnant that whole year of working in the clinic, and it was a really good experience for me. I worked with a lot of really wonderful nurse practitioners, which is part of how I started to have interest in becoming a nurse practitioner. I did have kind of a deep feeling, although it wasn't where I was at the time, that I was most likely going to be a single mom. And so I started thinking about what for me felt realistic as a single mom and what would provide a good foundation for myself and my child. So I worked with these nurse practitioners and I thought they were amazing. Just really, patients really liked them. I liked working with them. They were great teachers for me, who would bring me in to show me things and wanted me to learn. So overall, it was a really positive experience. I had my daughter in the spring of 2007. And we actually, for her pediatric care, we're seeing a family nurse practitioner that had been a home birth midwife. And she was wonderful. As a new young mom that was living away from my family, I really was so grateful for her. And I was starting to think about becoming a nurse practitioner. And as I spent time around her as well, I just really thought, wow, if I could be half as awesome as her, I will be happy with how I am as a provider, clinically and also like interpersonally. So I really started thinking that I was going to become a nurse practitioner. So I spent one more year at Evergreen as a single mom and finishing up prerequisites for nursing school. And then I applied to WSU's program, Washington State University. Going to WSU would allow me to return home. I had looked at kind of fast track programs of how to become a nurse practitioner that happened more quickly. So like a year of becoming a nurse and then changing to nurse practitioner. But they were all not in the Spokane area. And I very much wanted to return to my family and be near my family while I was raising my daughter. Part of the reason I wanted to be a nurse practitioner is that I specifically want to be a family nurse practitioner because they have the broadest scope. So my education and my licensure allows me to work with really infants from birth all the way to the elderly, to care for people while they're dying and everything in between. As far as nurse practitioner licensure in Washington State, we have independent practice. So that means that a physician does not need to oversee us. We can have a private practice on our own and have full scope of practice. Some of the only rules are like my family nurse practitioner licensing doesn't allow me to manage labor and birth, but I can provide pregnancy care. And then the other piece is that nurse practitioners can assist in surgery and can do some surgeries, but you cannot make first cut. So it's just a very broad degree in licensure, which I felt like would give me many options to explore different things that I was interested in. A lot of people, when I started saying I wanted to be a nurse practitioner, said, why don't you go to medical school? And for me, that just did not seem like a good fit. I hadn't thought about it that much until people started saying it, but then I did briefly consider and try to look into it. And it seemed like more stress and more work. And then I also had personally really loved the nurse practitioners that had provided care for me as a patient more than I had liked the physicians. So for me, that was kind of an influencing factor as well. The other piece was that med school and residency are typically, the culture around that is that you go wherever you need to go to get the hours and get the time in. It is not place-based. And my biggest goal was to return to my family and be near them. While I was in Western Washington, I really missed our traditions and our ways. And I had connections with other Indigenous people, but their ways weren't my ways. And so I really wanted to bring my daughter home and have time with my family. The other piece to this is that my parents had started their language journey and they were becoming fluent in Selk'chin, or Colville, Okanagan, Salish. And I really wanted my daughter to be learning from them so that she would have our language. And I wanted to learn more too, even though I'd spent a lot of time working on science prerequisite. So some challenges of being in nursing school and nurse practitioner school were that I was a single parent, and WSU Spokane still, even though this was 2008 when I entered, there is no on-campus childcare. When I had been at Evergreen, I was able to have on-campus childcare, and it made a huge difference in my life. So there was no on-campus childcare, which meant no subsidized childcare for students. And I also could not get any help from the state unless I had a job. And what was interesting is that the college specifically said, the College of Nursing was like, don't work while you are in nursing school. Specifically, do not work during the first year of nursing school because it's very demanding, it's very stressful, and we want you to pay attention to your school, not to work. So when I called the state, I actually called DSHS Working Connections, which pays for childcare assistance. And I was told that I should get a job at night because then they would pay for me to work at night and for me to sleep at some point during the day. And then I could also go to school. And that's how I could get childcare assistance. And I tried to figure out when I would actually sleep between nursing school and working a job and when I would see my daughter. And it really didn't compute. So that was a big barrier for me that I ended up getting around, but it was challenging. There's also a limit on how much money you can borrow for a second bachelor's degree. I didn't borrow any money for my first bachelor's, and I still had a cap on how much I could borrow for that second bachelor's degree. So it was challenging money-wise. I also transferred from the Evergreen State College, which focuses on like narrative description of your achievements and your academic work, to Washington State University, which is a more conventional state school, and it focused on letter grades. So there's a really different approach that focused more on rote memorization and test taking and grades rather than the learning process and kind of mastery and application of what you were learning. So that was challenging for me. And then there's also kind of this cultural piece about my classmates being really interested in the very, very like acute care and inpatient focus of nursing in the undergraduate program. And I was more interested in community health, working with communities, and really was approaching nursing as service. And so that was a little bit at odds with a lot of people in my cohort. And so that was challenging, but I did end up finding my people in that program. So community support is really what got me through my program. And I really wish I could remember look at what hour and what show it was on NPR sometime in the last couple of weeks, but there was somebody on the radio saying, I am not self-made and I am not self-sufficient. Like, we need to get over those ideas that we are, because we are all the things that our families and ancestors and communities have given us and helped us with. And so I really identified with that. And that is really what helped me to get through my nursing education and to be successful and make it through. I did create like a core group of friends that I'm still in contact with today. And it was a cohort model. So everybody moved through the courses together and the program together. And that was helpful for me in that I was able to build camaraderie and get to know people over time and form some deeper relationships. So even though we might have had some cultural differences, a feeling of being in it together and working toward goals was definitely helpful. I found faculty that I could look up to, and there was also Roberta Paul was the former director of WSU Native American Health Sciences, and so that program really focuses on like recruitment and retention of Native students in that university. And so there were social events, and we worked at summer camp for Native high school students. And that really provided a good connection for me on campus that was also helpful. And Robbie also helped me to get scholarships because of that funding situation that I was in. One other piece is that my mom and dad and my uncle all offered to watch my daughter while I was in school and clinicals. And that was a big undertaking. It was Monday through Friday from sometimes 5 in the morning because of early hospital clinicals until the evening. And then I was, working on schoolwork, even if I didn't have to be at clinical. And then one of my aunties watched my daughter most Sunday mornings, so I could also do more studying. And then my grandma offered to do all my laundry. So I would drop it off on Fridays and pick it back up on Sunday afternoons. And so it wouldn't have been possible without those people providing that really hands-on support for us, both my daughter and I. These are my kiddos. So you can see in this picture, I have my oldest daughter is on the left, and she's looking at one of my nursing textbooks, and it's an image of a woman checking her breast, doing a breast self-exam. And I walked in and she was looking at that, and I just thought that was so funny. So she kind of grew up while I was learning, and she spent a lot of, I was practicing my physical assessment on her, and she was around these texts and things. And then these other pictures are my other two kiddos when they were little. And they just kind of grew up in different circumstances than my oldest, because they were born when I was done being a student. Here's some pictures of Roberta Paul in the blue with me and Mireya, my oldest daughter. And then on the other side, me and my mom and Mireya. And that's at my nursing convocation, which is the nursing pinning, kind of some history of nursing with some Florence Nightingale roots there. So my wandering path since becoming a nurse and nurse practitioner are that in 2000, well, I guess it would have been 2010, actually, I became a health consultant for Salish School of Spokane, which is a native language immersion school that my mom started, and I was on the board of directors at the beginning. And pretty much since the school started and we started as a daycare. And since we did that, I was the health consultant. So kind of looking over health policies for the daycare and the school and helping make decisions if there were, kind of acting like a school nurse in a way. My first official job out of school was as a tuberculosis nurse at Spokane Regional Health District. And I really knew nothing about tuberculosis when I started that job. But what they really wanted to know is, can you work with lots of different types of people? Can you work with people that have been incarcerated? Can you work with people that are homeless? Can you work with people that speak languages other than English? And yes, and they trained me. So that was a very good one. And I liked being in the community. It was a very good experience. I also spent a short time as a family nurse practitioner at an urban native health clinic in the area. That clinic is not an IHS clinic, but it's a contractor. So they receive grants from IHS and have some agreements with IHS, even though they're not strictly an IHS clinic. They're also an FQHC, which is a federally qualified health center, which means that you are agreed to accept Medicaid and see patients on Medicaid, because that's usually a lower reimbursement. And then I left that job and I became an instructor at Washington State University College of Nursing. It had kind of been on my nursing bucket list, but I had not planned on teaching so soon, but it just happened. So I taught community health nursing, and I really liked that because I liked the teaching piece, but community health is really my passion. I'm really interested in prevention and upstream thinking and what we can do to help people be healthier in their own homes, not just what we can do in the hospital for them. And then I started working part-time as a nurse practitioner in pediatrics. And I work at a small private practice. And when I started there, there was one other nurse practitioner that was full-time. And then I joined part-time and then eventually moved to full-time. So that clinic is not very old. It's about, July was its 5th year anniversary. And I've been there for almost 4.5 years now. So that's been a really good experience. And I am lucky enough that I get to work with a lot of, because it's a newer clinic, I get to work with a lot of young families. So like at one point, 50% of the patients we were seeing were under the age of 5. So a lot of young kids, some adolescent care, but a lot of young kids, a lot of brand new babies. And we also work with, I would say the majority of families that are choosing home birth in the Spokane area come to our practice for pediatric care. The whole time I was doing this, I know I said it, but I've been kind of being a volunteer triage nurse for my urban Native community with answering a lot of questions. And then that actually did kind of become part of my job. As I was a nurse practitioner in pediatrics, I am on call for that clinic. So that's another piece of the job. But I also am pretty consistently fielding questions and helping with things in my community. And since the COVID-19 pandemic began, I've spent a lot of time helping manage things at Salish School of Spokane in that regard as well. One of the things that's been difficult for me is Hipaa. So I'm not even going to get into the long acronym, but essentially that's patient privacy. So I'm very strict, even though I'm very involved with my community and I hold a lot of knowledge about what's happening with individuals and with their health. I work very hard to still be respectful of privacy and not share information as if they were my patients in a more structured setting. And I have had colleagues that are non-native say some things to me about kind of conflict of interest and healthy boundaries, quote unquote. I've had some people say that I should not always be available to my community because it's not a healthy boundary and it's not professional. And it's a big disagreement that I have. I think that if we want to help our communities, we want to change our communities, and we want healing from trauma, and we want better health, those of us that are healers and have knowledge about health need to be available. And I think we should use our own cultural lens, not the American cultural lens, to make those decisions about that. I put up this picture of me because there was a day where I went to a funeral, a service for one of our good family friends. And so I'm wearing my ribbon skirt and I'm wearing a shirt that was made to honor him. And it was a big day and there were lots of tears. And then that afternoon, I had to go get my picture taken at the clinic because I was going to be hired on there. And so I was just like, oh man, I got to change my clothes and I'm going to put on this blazer and like these ideas about professionalism and what that looks like. And that sometimes is a little bit of a hard line for me to walk and find compromise. But I like being available to my community, and I see that it is helpful, and I'm able to use my knowledge and my education and license to influence outcomes. And so that feels really powerful for me. I want to talk a little bit about birth in my family. So I mentioned that my brother and I were born at a freestanding birth center. I've had my own kiddos at home with CPMs or LMs, home birth midwives. And I had my first child before I was a nurse. And when I was in nursing school, I kind of I was really fearful actually of going through like the obstetrics, labor and delivery portion of the nursing education, because my experience it was a long, hard birth, but I had felt empowered by it. And I felt like I had choice, and I really felt like it had been the right decision for me. And so I was very nervous about going into this education system that might try to tell me otherwise. But then I got there And I just had the most wonderful labor and delivery nurse instructor for that infant maternal health portion of my education. And she was amazing. And I also had the wonderful realization that the research and the body of literature really supports all of the choices that I had made. And so that it felt really good, and it made me happy. And I think that it's challenging because there's a lot of conflict in childbirth in America, but I felt reinforced, and like I had more information, and I still felt affirmed in my choices. For my family, birth has been a family event. So I had my parents with me at my first birth, and my mom doing a lot of hands-on support, even though I did have a doula present. And then my second birth, I had my mom acting as my doula, and then my husband and my oldest child at that birth. And that birth was funny because my husband had a child, but he had passed away, and he also had not been present at that child's birth. And so I thought, I want my husband to catch this baby and have this moment. And then, but I also had been secretly like visualizing myself catching my baby as like this really good moment. And so as I was starting to push, my midwife says, "Who's going to catch this baby?" And my husband starts to open his mouth, and I'm like, "I am." And my daughter's there, and my mom and my husband, and I caught my baby, and everybody's around me, and we're just feeling really happy about it all. And then my third child was also born at home, and my oldest child caught him, which we had planned. I knew that it was going to be my last child, and it somehow felt like kind of closing the circle for me. And having her catch him was really beautiful. We also had a fun moment because it was summer, and we have friends that are our neighbors, and our girls ran outside and yelled that it was a baby boy and that he was here, and we could hear our friends cheering through the window. I think my parents came right away to meet my kiddos if they weren't there when they were born. And I have a great tradition of my parents always saying, "What do you want to eat?" and helping me to have special foods that I want, or whatever sounds best after birth. I have been a doula for some of my friends and family, off and on. I have not really worked as a doula because I have spent the time on my nursing education and working as a nurse practitioner. But I did get to be the midwife's assistant when one of my nieces was born. And that was really wonderful. And I felt really honored that my sister-in-law chose that, because she had an option for somebody else, but she said she really would prefer to have me. So that was really, really sweet. I'm going to kind of switch gears now and talk a little bit about baby care and how evidence meets culture. Because this was one of the things that was so exciting to me when I began my nursing education, and as I went through my programs, is that I have yet to find almost any tradition of my people that isn't supported by research and the evidence. In nursing, there's a lot of focus on evidence-based practice. You look at research, you look at guidelines, and that's how you make decisions in the clinical setting. So I've spent a lot of time reading research articles, reading literature reviews, and then trying to connect that. And I still just get so excited. We don't need to justify why our practices are good for us, but there is something beautiful in being able to say, "See, I told you so," I guess. Maybe not very mature of me, but I like that part of being like, "Oh, here's this and this and this and this that supports all these things that we do." So I'm going to talk a little bit about these things. Pregnancy, labor and birth, very briefly on that one, breastfeeding, safe sleep, laying in, and first foods. And I want to talk about these just because I feel like these are some of the topics that end up being sometimes a source of conflict between Indigenous families and their care providers. And there's no clinical reason why there should be that conflict. It comes down to cultural issues. I want to talk a little bit about the US and healthcare, because a lot of what happens in these conflicts is that providers in the United States tend to be very culture bound. So they think the United States is the best, this is the way we do things here, and they're not really looking at what's happening internationally in regard to evidence, and not taking into account the importance of families making choices and what works for families. So I want to talk a little bit about that. It's a little bit political in the sense that some providers would not like these things to be talked about. I think it's important to acknowledge that the US spends a lot of money, much more than other similar nations, but doesn't have very good health outcomes. So we have the lowest life expectancy and the highest suicide rate among some of the richest 11 nations. We have high chronic disease burdens. We use lots of expensive technologies, but still have worse outcomes. And we have a lot more hospitalizations. And there's my source for that. But I think that you can't follow all these ideas from the US without acknowledging that we have room for improvement and we can do things differently and better. I think a lot of it comes down to worldviews and pregnancy. So one of the things that I see in my practice is some of this difference in worldviews in, is pregnancy an illness, or is it just another stage of normal for the human body? And I see this show up in different ways. A lot of times I see people in the United States saying, and in this area saying, you know, it's an illness, take it easy, don't lift, and don't exercise, don't work too hard. And that is in direct odds with our plateau culture here, and specifically Lakes culture in this area. So our culture is that you actually work harder and work to be strong, to make a strong baby, prepare for labor and for parenting, which is not easy work. And one of the stories that's told by Mourning Dove from the Colvilles is women, a traditional practice of women filling their skirts with rocks and walking up the mountain for exercise. And as they go, they get to drop rocks and say, my birth will be as easy as dropping this rock, dropping a rock, dropping another rock, and then getting to the top and saying, I did it. And that was actually a daily routine traditionally for pregnant women. So I think that's a big difference in worldview in our Indigenous traditions versus kind of the mainstream American culture of now of, is pregnancy an illness or is it normal? A little anecdote that I've run into is that I have a friend that really loves to run, and she has had 3 healthy pregnancies, 3 healthy children, but every pregnancy she was told, stop running, stop exercising. And so every pregnancy she would call me and say, they told me to stop running, but I like it and I want to keep doing it. And so every pregnancy we would have this conversation and I would kind of review what the research said and what the clinical guidelines said, which were, you can keep doing what you've been doing as long as it feels good and as long as you're listening to your body, and that you stop if something feels wrong or out of sorts. And that was really eye-opening for me because it really helped me to see that a lot of healthcare providers are making recommendations based on their own culture rather than evidence. And because that provider wasn't looking at guidelines and saying, oh yeah, everything says that you can keep doing this. This is what you need to look for. Instead saying, I don't think you should do this. It makes me nervous. And that's probably because they're viewing it as an illness rather than a normal state of being. I think that when we think about our Indigenous communities and family and decision making and mental health, we get into some conflicts there because Indigenous people have kinship models, extended kinship models, rather than nuclear families. And so providers are sometimes annoyed by how many people are coming to visits, or annoyed by who wants to be present during pregnancy visits or during labor and birth. And there's also some conflict around who gets to make decisions. So we see the paternalistic attitude of healthcare providers of saying, I know what's best and this is what we should do. So something that I've worked on in my own practice is that shared decision-making model of sharing information, and so that families can choose. And that is really what the evidence supports, is that people are given information and then they make choices about what feels like a good fit for their family and their health. These are some pictures. So I have a picture of my midwife here with my third kiddo. And I have a picture of her. She's non-native, but she's been very supportive of my cultural identity and of the kinship model that my family follows, and then also decision making. And I know that there have been times where I have made choices that are not choices that she would have made, and nothing is ever said. I've known her for a really long time, since I was a teen. And so I think that she's really, really beautiful care provider, in that it's about the person receiving the care, not about the provider and what they want. There's a picture of my brother and his wife when they're pregnant with their second child, and my niece there. This next slide is of my sister-in-law walking during both of her pregnancies, going on a hike. On this one on the bottom, they're going on a picnic. And then this other picture is of me at 41 weeks painting the Salish school, because I was waiting for a baby. And so I thought, let's keep busy and let's do stuff. I'm only going to touch really briefly on labor and birth, just because that's not what my clinical focus is and expertise is in. I thought about trying to become a labor and delivery nurse or becoming a nurse midwife, and I couldn't do it because after all my education, I really felt that those are the areas of practice that don't follow the guidelines or the evidence, and instead kind of rely on this cultural piece to make decisions, and that's not my culture. And just some brief things that I want to talk about there are just that mothers should be choosing where they give birth, who supports them, and evidence also supports home birth and mother-directed pushing and all of these other pieces. And I just couldn't stand to be in that environment that ignored all of those things. And again, that's the idea of being kind of culture bound and not looking at what's happening around the world and what people's traditions are and what the evidence says about what's best for pregnant and laboring and birthing people. This is a picture of my oldest niece being born at a hospital with nurse midwives. And I think that birth was interesting for my sister-in-law in that it was unmedicated and wonderful in many ways, but she really remembers that they made her get on her back to push, and she didn't like that. She wanted to be on all fours. And that was really a big part of her memory of that birth. And it did lead her to choose to have her second baby at home. The other pictures of my husband doing skin to skin with our second child while I'm showering after giving birth. I want to talk about breastfeeding now. Breastfeeding is a huge focus of my clinical practice now. I work at a clinic that's one of the only clinics in the Spokane area that has in-house lactation consultant services. and really puts a lot of effort into that. I want to talk a little bit about this because I find that a lot of providers are still giving kind of false information or not following guidelines. And I had my own experience with this. When I was in nursing school, we had just moved back to Spokane. I needed a new primary care for my daughter, and I was nursing her as a toddler. She was about 15 to 18 months old. And we were also bed sharing. And I actually went to a native nurse practitioner, and she told me I needed to stop breastfeeding and I needed to get her out of my bed. And it felt wrong to me at the time. And so I switched providers. I quit going to that provider. But as I progressed through my education, I also realized that none of her advice followed the evidence. So this is kind of, I'm recapping a little bit here about what the evidence and the literature says about breastfeeding. That we want to breastfeed within an hour of giving birth, that we want to have only breast milk for the first 6 months of life, that we should introduce solids around 6 months of age, and that there's some different guidelines around how long to breastfeed. So I most often rely on the World Health Organization guidelines around breastfeeding, and those say to breastfeed up to age 2 or beyond. But then there's the American Academy of Pediatrics that says to breastfeed to 12 months, and then as long as mutually desired by mother and baby. So it doesn't say you have to wean, but it kind of has some different language, and it's a younger age to which they want you to reach as a baseline goal. So those were those things that provider ignored when she spoke to me about nursing, is that my baby was just barely over a year old and she was telling me to wean. So we even run into this in our own communities where people aren't following the evidence, and then they're also actually using a non-Indigenous culture to try to influence what we're doing in our parenting practices. I really encourage families that if your provider is not supporting you in breastfeeding, that you try to get a new provider. Sometimes we don't have options, especially if we're in rural areas, but I think it's important that you have somebody that's a good fit for you, even if it means switching to a different provider in the same clinic, which is what I did. It worked well for me, but I think really it sometimes can feel like we don't have a choice, but really try to evaluate if you do, because it can make a big difference in the care that you receive if you find somebody that is a bit better match. I want to talk a little bit now about breastfeeding and infant growth, because this is the other thing that there's often a lot of conflict around, is that providers are just glued to these growth charts and looking at the numbers and talking about the chart and where the baby's at. The clinic that I work in makes a point to use the World Health Organization growth chart rather than the CDC growth chart, because that actually reflects more breastfed babies. And that is helpful for families, and especially as we're working with lots of breastfeeding families. It gives us better normals or averages to be looking at. In the first 3 months of life, we expect about an ounce a day of weight gain, and that's in the first 3 months. And then we see some slowing after that. Again, that's an average. There are babies that are going to gain more than that, and then there are babies that are going to gain less than that are still healthy and doing well. So when I look at these growth charts, some of the things that I'm looking at are proportionality. So how are height and weight in proportion to one another? Is this a very long, skinny baby? Is this a very short, chunky baby? And what is putting those pieces together? In general, I'm looking for those percentages, the rate of growth, to be somewhat near one another. I'm also looking at trends over time. So I don't believe that unless we're in a weight loss situation, or baby has dropped off of the chart, like something drastic is going on, there's no one data point that should drastically change everything that we're doing. So I'm looking at trends over time, and not day to day, because that really doesn't serve us, but looking at trends over weeks and months to make sure that infants are growing well and developing well. When it comes to interventions around growth and weight gain, I really practice that we get help from lactation support first, that I sometimes give advice about, for now, until you can see a lactation consultant, these are the things I want you to do. And then let that person change the plan, because they're able to do more hands-on pieces and provide a better plan sometimes that's a little bit more nuanced than what I can do in the short visits that I'm seeing people for. I recommend that parents seek social support. So whether that's La Leche League or other breastfeeding support groups, I think that can also be very helpful. And if we're in the situation of needing to supplement, I will pretty much always, unless parents are feeling just super frustrated or having mental health issues or severe pain, I will almost always try to work on supplementing with breast milk rather than using formula to supplement if we need to do that. Milk sharing is also becoming a little bit more accepted. That's a traditional practice that we've had for a really long time. My sister-in-law and I, and she's in this picture here, we have milk shared with our babies. And it was so helpful, and it's becoming more acceptable now, and we're a little bit more open to it culturally in the US. And so I think that that's really helpful, because that may be an option for people that are dealing with low supply. So that's some of the work that I do around infant growth. And again, I really, if parents are having conflict with their provider about weight gain and about growth, there really needs to be some bigger conversations about what the goals are, what the expectations are. Find out which growth chart your provider is using, and whether or not they're willing to look at the World Health Organization chart instead. Talk to them about trends and proportionality and what's going on there. Because if we drop 5% in 2 months, it really isn't a big deal, but some people are really glued to those percentages. So we need to be watching that and thinking about that. I like this picture of my sister-in-law because she's multitasking. She's reading a book while she nurses this little baby. On the left, we have a picture of a friend that I was a doula for, and this was at the end of a really long, hard labor. And she, at this point, just felt so exhausted. And she told me recently that she was actually feeling like disassociated from her body a little bit, and she felt like she couldn't lift her arms. And so I was actually propping her arms and propping up baby, and then helping position baby to have one of her first feedings. And then this other picture is of my friend Brooke and her baby Brielle. And this is just classic toddler nursing, right? Of the baby yoga while they're nursing, and all the odd positions that they do. And I'm really proud of Brooke. I don't think anybody had breastfed in her family for at least one generation, and maybe more. And she's done a great job of taking Brielle past age 1. So I've been really happy with that. Doing a good job and cracking her mom up there. Safe sleep is kind of another hot topic when it comes to conflict with pediatric providers and families. Cradle boards and baby boards are a great safe sleep option. There's plenty of information around that, and it is a traditional safe sleep space. It works well. One of the things that I sometimes address, I've actually run into some providers that work at Shriners in this area saying that baby boards cause hip dysplasia. It's a myth. There's no evidence that supports that. I do think that we do not want to create straight, like splinted legs in the baby board. We want to have kind of some flex in the hips and have the knees bent a little bit so that they're comfortable, but that they still feel that snug feeling, right? And that they still can't roll in that board, because that's part of what makes it safe sleep, is that they're held and comforted in this back position, laying on their back. So I think about having their legs as like frog legs. So a little, like some flexion in the hips, a little bit in the knees too, and the feet kind of coming together. There's plenty of information from, I believe it's National Institute of Health, that talks about baby board as a safe sleep option, especially among, just that there's plenty of evidence that Native families can be using that, and that it shouldn't be dissuaded or discouraged from doing so. When it comes to bed sharing, I try to take a more moderate approach. La Leche League has a great list of the things that we can do to make bed sharing safe with our babies. So taking off mattress toppers, keeping the sleep space free of blankets and pillows, making sure babies can't roll off the bed or get stuck between the bed and the wall. A lot of there's Dr. Oh, I'm going to forget his last name. But there is a sleep lab at Notre Dame that's more of an anthropological focus rather than a health and safety focus. But it shows that breastfeeding parents are highly attuned to what their babies are doing in their sleep. And those same studies have kind of pointed out that it may not be the bed sharing that's the risk, it's about modern bedding. Yes, James McKenna, thank you so much. Thanks, Dorothy. So Dr. McKenna at Notre Dame. And so what's pointed out is that modern bedding is something that contributes to risk. So fluffy pillows and blankets and these very tall beds all contribute to risk for SIDS, suffocation, and those other pieces. So that's something that I think is important to pay attention to. But I don't ever tell families not to bed share. I talk about how to do it safely, because in my experience, people are going to do what works. So much of parenthood is survival and doing what works for you and your baby, and it works for people. So I want them to just be safe in it, know what some of the risks are, and know how to make it safer for their families. I think the things that we can work on are, the environment of the blankets and pillows and those pieces, but we can also work on the parts of bed sharing that don't have a benefit to babies. Like, please don't share your bed if you've taken a Benadryl or drank a beer, or something that alters your level of consciousness and your awareness of your baby. We know that smoking increases the risk of SIDS. So those are things that don't benefit babies in the way that bed sharing does and have risk associated with them. I want to address bed sharing after the age of 1. SIDS risk and suffocation risk after the age of 1 really drops significantly. Babies are mobile. They move themselves out of positions. They're able to communicate a little bit better. And really, we shouldn't have our providers telling people not to bed share after the age of 1. There's no evidence to support that, because there is no risk. And I know that many of us parents have felt, this kid will never leave my bed. They eventually leave your bed. It's okay. And we don't need somebody else telling us anything that isn't related to safety or health of our child. So there's nothing wrong after 1. In the first year, we need to be careful. We need to be safe in our sleep. But after 1, I really don't want to hear about providers that are kind of bullying families about where their child is sleeping, especially if it's working for the family. So in this picture, I have, that's my son on the right, and the smaller baby is Brielle when she was little. And she's kind of she's a niece to me. These babies are being raised together, and they're, in our language, we call it chapsius, where it's, I think of it as like, we call my nieces and my daughter's sister cousins. It's that kinship system of, you're of the same generation and you're raised together and you're parented by the adult peers. And so they're being raised together, and that's them in the pack and play in their boards, taking naps when they were babies. This picture here on the left is my sister-in-law, and that she's just a few days postpartum, and we have my second niece in the cradle board, and I'm showing my sister-in-law how to use that board and wrap up baby. My sister-in-law is Puerto Rican, but she is living here in Washington with us and has adopted so much of our cultural practices and just supports us in that. And so it's been a really wonderful thing to share. And then this is my oldest daughter on the right in her baby board. More baby board pictures because they're just too cute, you guys. So this is my dad fell asleep with the baby board in his lap with my niece in there. And then my brother and his wife with my niece in her board. And that's their first child. So the adoring first parents, I love it. I like these pictures. I pulled these in here because I think that these are great examples of bed sharing while also having infants in their own sleep space in a way. So this top picture is one of the like in bed bassinets. And that's something that my brother and his wife have really liked using. And it absolutely meets all the safe sleep guidelines and is a great option for families if they don't have access to a baby board or they're not interested in that. And then this bottom picture again is my niece Brielle, and she's in her board in her mom's bed. So her mom is sleeping, but Brielle also has her own sleep space there. So those are great options for bed sharing too. I want to talk a little bit about the postpartum period because I think that one of the things that it really hurts modern families is sometimes the lack of the kinship, like the broader kinship system and multi-generational households. Because I see a lot of families that are very isolated in their parenting and in their postpartum time. So, you know, maybe one of the parents, the parent that's given birth is home, and maybe the other parent is able to take some time off of work and is wrangling toddlers and trying to keep up with the household. But I think a lot of families are missing that opportunity for kind of an extended community to care for them. And so I think that that's really important. That's something that sometimes I see providers having conflict with, as far as sometimes not understanding how those intergenerational dynamics work if Indigenous families do come to clinics with that. I think we also sometimes miss out on this connection for the time of like laying in or having moms rest and take it easy. I think too often I'm seeing moms who are expected to kind of like bounce back and get back to what they were doing before the baby. And I do see that compromise breastfeeding and sometimes poor weight gain because moms are trying to do other things besides just settle and feed baby. And then I also see them kind of hinder their own recovery from pregnancy and birth. I have these pictures here of auntie and uncle with these babies, because I think that's part of one of our beautiful traditions, is having that extended family. I really like to talk to parents about meal trains and learning how to ask for help. You know, we've lost some of that extended community, and I think it's so important for, not always, but if we have, I think it's so important to figure out how to ask for help, and how, or if you feel like you can't ask, how to task somebody else close to you to ask for help for you, if that makes sense. So I like to encourage people to like have their mom or their sister or an auntie or somebody ask other people for help with meals. I'm a big fan of mealtrain.com. I talk a lot to parents about have the real helpers come to you. The people that want to help take care of you as parents, not, I call them baby tourists that just want to come and see a cute baby and hold a cute baby. That's not what parents need help with. I think that's been, you know, having a baby during COVID has been challenging for a lot of people because we maybe don't have the same supports. But one of the secret blessings is that it's okay. It's like acceptable to be pickier about who is in your home. And I'm really encouraging parents, like, choose the people that will help you, not the people that are there for fun. You know, pick the people that will fold your laundry and scrub your toilet. These are some pictures. So my niece at her naming ceremony, and just thinking she had her great grandparents there and her grandparents and great aunts and great uncles and cousins, and just that idea of extended community welcoming a baby and everybody kind of vowing their support and saying that they're going to participate in this child's life is a really beautiful and important tradition in this area. And then I have this picture of my my second niece being held by my oldest, and then her sisters there on the sides. So just thinking about how birth affects the kids that have come before and about their relationships to each other. It's not just about parent-child, it's about what it does to the whole extended family. So again, those are the chapsius, the sister cousins. One of the, I want to talk about first foods now, because lately I've had a lot of families, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, say that they've had pushback about baby-led weaning from providers. And I always think, I'm like, baby-led weaning, when did we start naming it something? It's just feeding babies. That's probably how we've been doing it for 10,000 years here on the plateau, right? I have looked into this. There's no evidence that says that baby-led weaning is bad. We have to talk about risk of choking, and that's with any solid food, whether that's a puree or a table food. So I have some general kind of guidelines or suggestions. My one strong rule is no raw honey until after 12 months of age. I have had a patient with baby botulism. It's terrifying. So that's like my one firm rule. Everything else, guidelines. So soft and small. If it fits into that, your baby can have it. And that's, like I said, what we've been doing for a long time. In general, I recommend following baby's lead. I typically tell parents, wait till 6 months. That's when babies are able to sit up a little bit. It's typically when they're developmentally interested. Are there going to be outliers? Yes. Follow baby's lead. So some babies might want tastes at 4 months old. They're super interested, and they might taste it and go, what? That was not as exciting as I thought. That's that social piece, right? Babies are watching their caregivers. They're watching their siblings. They're watching that family. What are you doing? I want to do that too. And so I always tell parents, like, yes, try it. But if baby isn't really interested in the act of eating it, that's okay. Just let them play with the food. So follow baby's lead. Some babies are not going to be really interested in solids until up to 7 or 8 months, and that's okay. I do worry about kiddos when we start to hit the 9-month mark. If kiddos are really still very avoidant of solids, I start to go, okay, is there a sensory issue? Is there something physiological going on here that we need to have addressed if we're really just straight refusing? And then I kind of have some general guidelines about how much and when. So at 6 months, I'm saying taste, feeding once a day, and then kind of titrating up or advancing the diet as baby wants, with a goal of around 9 months of age, feeding solids about 3 times a day. And then at 12 months, moving to more of a toddler diet of 3 meals a day and 2 to 3 snacks. I would also add that those snacks don't have to be solid food. Some of those snacks may be breast milk at that point still, and that continue into toddlerhood. I really do encourage families to focus on fruits and vegetables and proteins and healthy fats. A lot of our convenience foods, like the puffs and the teething crackers and those things, one, not the best nutrition, not horrible, but not the best. And then second, constipation. They almost all have a lot of rice product in it. And so I see a lot of kiddos that are struggling with constipation if the diet is out of balance by eating too many of those things. So those are little notes. There's really baby-led weaning, fancy word for teaching our babies how to eat solids, fancy phrase. And I think there's no reason why babies can't be learning to self-feed and follow their own lead when it comes to feeding solids. We don't need to be spoon feeding if we don't want to. These pictures here, I have Brooke and Brielle, and on the left, they're digging camas, and then on the right, they're picking huckleberries together. And that's actually, I think some of those might be Salish school field trips. More pictures of traditional foods. This is my niece, Kufa Musket, and she's chewing on some deer venison. And then there's a picture of some camas, and then we have Victoria digging camas there. And then this is my oldest when she was younger in the water here, and she's digging water potato on the Kalispell Reservation, which is something that our students do most falls as a school field trip. That's kind of my more structured PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about, yes, Wapato. Yes. And I want to talk a little bit about Salish School of Spokane. So, because I've mentioned it kind of throughout my presentation, but it's a native language immersion school that's in Spokane, and we serve currently from 6 months old up to high school. And so we kind of grew it starting as daycare and then moving forward to the point where we now have middle school and high school students. And it's a big endeavor in that we don't have fluent speakers, right? We haven't been creating new fluent speakers, which is the case for most of the tribes in the inland Northwest and the Pacific Northwest, and a lot of indigenous languages across the world, that we're actually losing speakers instead of gaining new speakers. So we have a lot of staff for what we do, because we are constantly rotating out staff to attend Salish language classes, and so that they can become fluent as part of their job. So they're in adult education classes, and they have homework and tests and quizzes, and then they're also in the classroom using as much Salish as they know. And one of the things that is kind of overlapped with my clinical work and then what we've learned at Salish School is that everything kind of comes down to community care. We've learned that if people don't have housing and don't have transportation and all these other pieces, they can't focus on learning our language. So we have to do this care for our community that allows them these basic parts of life so that they can learn and share and enjoy our language. So that's something that I've spent a lot of time working on. Most of the time I've done fundraising work for the school by being on the board of directors. I am not fluent in my language. It's a work in progress because I've spent so much time on the clinical side of things. But all the rest of my family is, and my kiddos are more fluent than I am because what we're doing is working, and they're at school all day in our language. So it's really great. They are my teachers, and my family spends a lot of time being my teacher too. Trying to think anything else I want to say about that. I think, Rhonda, I might open up for some questions unless there's something else you want me to address more. Oh, some questions about breast pumps and timelines on when you can use them. Yeah.
And we also have, you know, in addition to the 6 months, just so many people that what they're provided with is a completely inadequate, you know, hand pump, and that there's just absolutely no way that someone, you know, being able to use Medicaid and those particular pumps, you know, we know that even with a high quality pump, that often supply still goes down, and you know that's a risk. And when we have, you know, our people that have these burdens and these financial stressors also have the poorest quality level of equipment, it just compounds disparities. So I have a question for you.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is in Canada. I mean, my understanding is that they were provided, but I know every province is very different. Territories can be very different.
Yeah.
But the question I have for you is a little bit about the baby boards, and that I feel like there is such a I've heard from people, and I don't agree, but I just want you to speak to it, about how it's counterintuitive to attachment parenting, and that basically this idea that we should have our babies on our bodies all the time, and that we're actually, you know, creating independence and separation, and you know, not being connected to our people, which is a criticism that's definitely not culturally grounded or big picture.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to see if you could speak to
Yeah.
that.
You know, I think just from my own experience, I think that baby can be right there. And so I don't, I guess I have bed shared with my babies and used cradle boards and used co-sleepers and lots of different ways of sleeping together. But I guess for me, I never felt that my baby was away, because my baby was, I could touch my baby, and my baby was right there. And I think that the piece of attachment parenting that I think is good is being responsiveness, right? And teaching trust to infants in the first year of life. I think that sometimes where I see attachment parenting go wrong is I see a lot of parents that end up relinquishing all boundaries. And if it's working for people, I think nothing of it. But if people are coming in and parents are kind of having their mental health suffer because they're kind of, moms are touched out, like this baby's always physically on me and I'm always holding, and my back hurts and my neck hurts and all these pieces. I'm like, so this is not serving you, and you can give yourself permission to do things in a different way that works for you. And so I think it's, you know, the two extremes end up not being helpful. And so having sometimes more moderate approaches can work better for families. Like, we want to be responsive. We also have to remember that we're raising adults. They're not going to be babies forever. And so we do want them to eventually sleep independently. And it's not that we need to put them in a crib down the hall when they're 2 weeks old, but I think a cradle board is a really beautiful moderate step where baby is in an independent sleep space, but is within arm's reach, can actually be in the bed with families and right there. And I think is a really nice option. Does that kind of address it, Rhonda?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, you're right, that we do kind of put all of these just very, very idealized, you know, philosophies on real life. And,
Yeah.
you know, like I remember, you know, I've done a lot of work with just different, I mean, you know, this, Danica, just with different birth centers in multiple different communities and cultures and countries in Africa. And, you know, like there was this article going around that was, you know, why babies don't cry in Africa. And I was just like, and, you know, it was this piece of that, yes, you know, having our babies be tended to and not in buckets, we absolutely need to counter that. And also having people within four walls all alone all day long, where there is this feeling that they must, you know, like sacrifice ever eating or showering or mental health or anything, you know, to have some sort of an ideal is also really hard. So I guess let's just bridge this, because, you know, for the people who are trying to help prepare families with childbirth education, and, you know, when, you know, there's a lot of things that we can think, oh, I won't do that when I'm a parent, or this is the way I want to be. And that's a beginning of a journey, right? You know, it's a it's okay to just, you know, you be humbled. It's okay
Yes.
to just, you know, like try and craft your vision. And it doesn't mean you're wrong if it needs to change a little bit. Like I have those families who very, very, very much want to bed share, but their babies are absolutely restless and they don't find peace, you know, with sharing a bed. And, you know,
Yes.
there is this just fluidity that you have to have, and constant being humbled as a parent. But
It's so
with
true.
these different things you've talked about with breastfeeding, with, you know, with these different things, like what would, from as an experienced mother, as a person who, you know, is committed to watching kids grow up through this school and also caring for them and their health and their wellness, as a nurse practitioner, like what gems would you really encourage these choice makers or people supporting families to
Yeah.
really talk about and share?
Yeah. I think that piece about moderation is really important. Like, I tell parents almost every day in clinic, I think, that like parenting is survival. Like we all have all these ideologies that we come with. And then as parenting unfolds, we usually can't keep up with all of them, or we will harm ourselves trying. And so I really just try to remind people, like, it's day by day, it's survival, and almost every family ends up doing what works for them in some way. And it can even feel like, this is crazy, like this is not what I wanted to do, and this is, I don't know if we can keep doing this, but I also can't think about changing it, because thinking about going through some kind of transition period sounds even worse than what we're doing right now. So that piece about moderation, you're doing what works and you're in survival mode. I think the other piece too, I like parents to read. I like them to think about what their values are. I like them to make some plans about how they want things to be and what's important to them. And then I also remind them that, like you said, you have to be flexible, because every kid is going to be different, and they all have their own personalities, and every kid gets a different parent, because we keep growing and changing as adults too. And so we value different things at different times, or we're in different like logistical situations as well. So I encourage families, like, make a plan and then be ready for it to change. So like, be well prepared, because you don't know what's going to happen next, I think is an important piece. Other gems, that piece about learning to ask for help, or how to get other people to ask for help for you. I think if the families that I see that do not begin to figure that out, struggle, because they think that they're going to do it on their own. And some families can. Some people, you know, they have a great relationship with their partner. They maybe have, you know, financial privilege, and they have like a really nice situation logistically. But life is unpredictable, and things can happen that will upset that. And you might kind of lose some of the ease that you were parenting with. And so I think that asking for help and figuring out who your people are is one important piece of advice. So at our clinic, we actually do, we don't bill for them. They're like prenatal meet and greets, where you can sit with us and ask the providers questions and have conversation. And that's something that, you know, I'm there to answer the parents' questions, but that's one of the things that I usually turn around and ask them. Like, I'm not really going to influence where they're giving birth or who their provider is. I really find that I'm not even going to influence their decision to breastfeed or not, or some of these other pieces. But I can say, who are your people? Do you have friends and family that live nearby? Oh, nobody's nearby. Okay, you know, are they going to come visit? Are you going to be on the phone with them? Like, who are your helpers? And so I think that that's an important piece too, of like identifying who the social supports are. Parenting can be so isolating if we don't build that community. And it's better if you have somebody to laugh with and commiserate with during the good and the bad and the ugly of parenting.
Okay, I've changed the setting, so if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, or just share about your experience, you know, it's please do. Well, if people want to think, I'm going to ask another one.
Okay.
What can you describe, like whether a baby is like, just, you know, let's not confuse it with whether if they have a home birth or a hospital birth, but what should we prepare parents for what baby care in a pediatric schedule looks like for that first?
Yeah. I always tell parents it's the opposite of pregnancy. So we're going to have more visits at the beginning and less as your child gets older. So we really work in conjunction with our home birth midwives, because a lot of them will do the newborn care up until sometimes 1 or 2 months of age. And we're fine with that. So, and they always can call us if there's something that they have questions about. But in general, especially if babies are born in the hospital, we'll see them usually in the first week of life, so that we can help evaluate jaundice when they're at home, and make sure that feeding questions are answered, and then just general questions. I'm more and more find myself kind of shocked, because I have this, both of my parents are from really pretty big families, one of 5 and one of 7. And so I have these cousins that are younger than me that I grew up around as babies. And I still find myself for some reason being shocked at some people who have maybe never even held a baby and now they have their own baby. And so I really encourage new parents, like, bring your list of questions, keep a note in your phone. If it's urgent, call us, you know, but if it's, can I use lotion? What do I do if this, you know, like, what if they don't poop? How often should they poop? All those things. Bring that list. And so we do a lot of focus on like the parent education piece and being available for questions in that first 2 weeks. So we usually do a weight check right after birth, and then another one a week later. And then if things are going well, we usually see them when they're a month old. And then the routine schedule here in the States is for 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, and then 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, 18 months, and then it goes to every 6 months. And then at 3 years old, we move to once a year. So a lot of times I do see quite a few families that choose not to immunize. And I always think it's important to talk about why well visits and checkups are important for kiddos in the first year, even if you're choosing not to immunize, because there's so many things that we're checking as far as growth and development. So we're taking heights, we're taking weights, we're making sure that, like, doing a physical exam, we're looking for small things that maybe parents don't know what the normal is, as far as muscle tone, and then also looking at like motor milestones as far as lifting head, core strength. Are we rolling? Are we sitting up in the general range that we expect them to? And so that's like that's really what the majority of the visit focuses on, is that development piece. I think we're seeing more and more feeding issues and reflux issues. And when I've talked to I work with a lot of feeding therapists and nutritionists and occupational therapists, and some of them have been in practice for 20, 30 years. And they're like, yeah, kids seem different now. Like, we're just seeing different stuff going on. So those are some of the things I'm also checking for, because we can be a little bit more proactive now when it comes to some of those things. I talked about solid foods. I talked about maybe some babies being like avoidant of solids at an age where we would expect them to be interested. And so I'm kind of checking for those things too. And then also safety pieces, you know, one of the hard parts of my job is that we have patients die and their children. It's so painful for their families and their siblings and the community, and it's painful for us. So another piece of that is just talking about like, hey, what are the things that happen to kids that we can work to avoid? What should you be thinking ahead to? I do a lot of car seat checking too, of like, oh, it's time to move from this lift out infant seat to this bigger seat. They've outgrown it. So there's a lot of things that we're doing at those visits too that are about education and the things that parents do when they're at home with their kids.
Can you see the chat box?
I can. I was just looking like that. Oh, I like this idea of parents that have never been around a baby and having a doll to kind of.
What that I really actually love is, do you know what the Waldorf heavy babies are? So they're filled with like millet, and you know, they have arms and legs, and they actually get warm when they're against your body. But you know, for things such as you know, like finding where in your home you can have just these lovely little nursing nests, you know, like where you can, if you're sitting in this, you know, in this particular spot, you know, where's your phone and your water, and, you know, how can your arms be able to relax so that you can just, you know, let your shoulders go? What about your legs? Are they going to go numb in this position? Like, how do you do that? And then moving the baby in all these different positions. But you know, there's you know, I like those in particular because they just kind of fall into you, and have the weight of a baby as well. And you know, I made my own, so it's not, they're not complicated. They sell kits and things, but just, you know, and I've used the plastic mannequin dolls as well, but you know, you just can't bend their arms and legs in the same kind of way, and so I feel like they're helpful for teaching things like, you know, what to expect with just anatomy and size, and but the feeling, I almost feel like, you know, a bag of rice is a little bit better than like a light plastic or something, you know. But just that you know, weight on a body, and just how to move through life, and also things like, you know, and for people teaching childbirth classes, it might be about questions about baby wraps or car seats, or, you know, a lot of and you know, Danica provided me some resources for just newborn safety, for our newborn safety module in the Indigenous childbirth ed program, just because, you know, you will, the reason, for example, in Washington State that Medicaid will pay for a childbirth class is for people to attend that, is really centered around public health. It's really centered around, you know, there's less interest on, you know, comfort measures for birth, you know, in terms of paying for this through Medicaid, and a lot more interest in, you know, talking about immunizations and car seats, and, you know, and safe sleep. And so, you know, those questions are actually required, or those aspects of public health are requirements to speak about in childbirth classes. And that can happen with a handout or a demo or a story, you know, or print materials, whatever that looks like. But being able to, you know, prepare families that, you know, what does the first day look like, and then what does the first week look like, and what does the first 2 weeks look like, and that those are such different planets as a parent, you know. Like if we had to stay in the, you know, day 4 you know, for months, you know, no, it's just hard. And there are other days that are just really challenging all along the parenting journey. But what I will say is that in childbirth classes, so many people are just, they think about the baby clothes and the diapers, but actually that babies feed all day, and, you know, like that aspect is really hard to prepare people for, and the brokenness of the care, that it's kind of constant, that it might be, you know, for 2 hours straight, and then every 15 minutes, and then every 5, and then, you know, you can't settle because you just expect that the baby's going to wake any second, and oh, your window just was lost. But with people, especially having their first baby, how to help prepare them for this extraordinary challenge as well as gift is a really delicate dance. You know, I don't want any parent to be, you know, like all the things that are projected on new families of, you know, sleep now, or you're never gonna, you know, you're never gonna have sex again, or you're like, your life is over. Just all of the things that are put on people is not honoring, you know, that, yeah, they're different. Yeah, their life is different. And it's also this phenomenal gift and blessing, you know, in their life and in their arms. And so it's that dance of like honoring that, yeah, just like birth, that yes, this is hard. This is transformative. This could be painful. This can be bring you to your knees, and also that it's supposed to be a big deal. And dancing with providing information, answering the questions that people, you know, have already thought to ask, and also just knowing that there's so much, like I spend a lot of time just giving people good resources to look back on later, because especially in pregnancy, a lot of times people can't take it in. You know, they're not able to be thinking about that 3-month-old yet, of course. But knowing where the good resources are, and especially with overburdened healthcare systems, you know, can be really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a little bit of this fine dance that we do of if we're providing information and we're answering the questions, but sometimes we see a need that they're not asking about, but we see some dynamic or something that's unfolding. And how do we use wisdom to maybe help address that, even if they aren't seeing it themselves, but in a way that's kind and gentle and doesn't, some families don't want to hear it. And then others are really grateful when I say something. And so I never know what I'm walking into if I say, well, I noticed this, or sounds like you're doing a lot. Like, tell me about that. And I think that there are some tricky conversations when it comes to parenting bringing you to your knees, because it can be really hard to go through that initiation and have life change and be different.
Okay, any other questions? Or I'm gonna just give some pause, and if anyone wants to just share their stories of you know, babyness, or anything that we spoke about with this theme. Can you speak a little bit? I'm sorry, I'm the one who keeps coming up with the questions. Please do unmute, and but I one more came up, and just in that, do you have anything to share or say about just, you know, babies and children, and seeing the sponges that children are in regards to language, and just speak a little bit about that, about, you know, reclaiming language?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the beautiful thing about babies and kids is that there's no inner critic around language learning. So they're very much, they hear it and they understand it, and then they start speaking. And whereas as an adult learner, there's so much more challenge in, oh, I'm not saying it the way that person said it. I'm saying it wrong. I don't know if I should even bother to say it because it doesn't sound right. There's so much inner critic. And the beautiful thing of kids is just they just roll with it. And so I love seeing bilingual kids in my practice, and then also at the school. And so I would say that almost all of my kids, their first word has been in English, but their second or third word has been in Salish. And it's been something that's really cool to see. And it's funny too, because kiddos are really smart. And so they're able to do this really cool thing called code switching, which is where, as they get older, they're able to identify who speaks what language and sort out who they should talk to in what language. And so it's been really fun to see my kids, identify that my 83-year-old Irish American grandma does not speak Salish, and that she will not know what they're saying. And so switching, telling us something in Salish and then switching to telling her something in English. And it's so relaxed for them. Whereas I find with a lot of adults, it can be kind of anxiety inducing. And for kids, it's like you introduce the littlest thing. We will have students that come to our school that have zero Salish language, and they're 4. And they have new words like their first day. And then their second day, they have more words. And months later, I mean, it's language explosion. It's exponential. And it's really, really amazing to watch. I think there was another. That's fun, this 8-year-old experimenting with languages.
And then I also see, Dorothy writing, do you encourage families to come to pediatric visits, and how do you involve them? I think that you spoke a little bit about just family health education, but there are clinics that are very different, and you might get 5 minutes with a provider, or you might have a great deal more.
Yeah. So in our practice, we do 20-minute well childs for once you're established, and our newborn visit is usually 40 minutes long. And I think there was a question about, how much, as when it comes to, there's a question about holding space for emotional process as it arises. And one of the things that I love about my job and being in this practice with a little bit of a different model is, there are times where I just go into the room and I'm like, oh, wow, this person really needs the extra time. And I just know that I'm going to get behind in my schedule. And that's just how it is. And not every provider is willing to do that. But I would say that in the practice that I've chosen to work in, we just make room for that. And I will say too, that when it comes to the emotional process piece, like I am in a certain role in my job, but because we have our lactation consultant who spends 60 to 90 minutes with moms, I find out a lot of information from her, because we'd kind of joke about the chair in her room, the recliner where moms sit, like everything comes out in the chair. And, so moms really are able to get a lot of good support from her as well. And I find out a lot about what's going on in families that I might not have known otherwise, that she's able to communicate to me. And I do think it's like the piece that's missing in most practice is that emotional piece. And then when we talk about I talked a little bit about family education and including, but I really when there's somebody in the room that I don't know, I'm like, oh, hi, I'm Danica. Are you grandma? Are you auntie? Or, I'm asking, and I'm like, okay. And I want to involve, and I want to, I'm always trying to assess that relationship between the parents and then the extended family, because it's very possible that there's conflict between those people of parents wanting to do things differently than how their parents raised them, or everybody being on the same page. And so I make sure to address the whole room, rather yes, it's about the parents of the child, but I want to make sure that they brought other people to the appointment. So I'm including them, and I'm saying, anybody else, any questions? Grandma, you have questions? Dad? I'm trying to elicit that and get that feedback from them. And it's really a fun part of my job, because, grandparents will often say, wow, this sounds really different. When I was having kids, they said to do this. Or when my other daughter had kids, they could turn the car seat forward at a year old. And I'm like, yeah, I know. all 3 of my kids have had different car seat recommendations because they're spread out. It just keeps changing. Here's where we're at now. This is why. This is what we know. So I think just, choosing to address everybody in the room and take time for everybody to feel part of it, because I think there's that cultural piece of like, I really believe that babies belong to the parents, but they belong to the whole extended family as well. And that it's important to include them.
And yeah, you, in the comments of just speaking to how, how pregnant people really need to have an additional, and that these conversations about breastfeeding, these conversations about newborn care, like a lot of it really does need to begin in pregnancy, which is why, why we need to talk about it in childbirth classes, why it needs to be there, is because it does matter, and people need to process and, come, have conversations with the other people in their life that are going to be contributing to the care of this baby. But yeah, I think that it would benefit, all families to have that share, that time, whether it's with their provider or their lactation consultant or their midwife, or, for complicated health issues, and that the system is really broken in that way. And that, and that's where sometimes we really need to arm the family and the community to step in and fill in those gaps. Is because, there is so much more need than there is space on a clinic schedule. And that can be challenging for people.
And that's absolutely why we need to be asking, who are the support people? Who do you have in your community? Who are the people that you can call in the middle of the night when your baby's fussy and you can't get them to calm down? Who, and really, who's going to come over and hold the baby so you can have a break, having those kind of conversations.
Okay, any other thoughts or questions, or should we move towards a closing?
If there aren't any more questions, I'm happy just to sing a bit of a song before we close, before we say goodbye.
Beautiful, thank you.
Yeah, this is the women's song, and I learned it from my mom, who learned it from our elder Trish Manuel, who's up in BC, the Okanagan, which is kind of a cousin of the Synackstx lakes. And this is the women's song. Ho, 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 ah-hee-oh, ho, ah-hee-oh, ho, 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 ah-hee-oh, ah-hee-oh, ho, 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 ah-hee-oh. Ho, 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 ah-hee-oh, ho, ah-hee-oh, ho, 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 ah-hee-oh, ah-hee-oh, ho, 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 ho. I'm just gonna leave you with that short piece of that. Thank you all so much for listening to some of my journey and my story.